Anytime you're ready. Yep.
Your Honors, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, opposing counsel, may it please the court. The prosecution was fishing. They went fishing for evidence. They went fishing for a big fish in Miss Covington. Unfortunately, their long trip out to sea didn't yield them any results. Now, in the month of April, there was a casino license up for issuance in Midlands. Miss Covington was the chairperson of that board that would issue the license, and she was hounded by many proposals, two of which stood out above the rest. The first was a local poker player, famous poker player. The second was Avery Bancroft, the man that you've heard so much about today. Miss Covington decided that his proposal was good enough that she wanted to meet with Mr. Bancroft before she voted on his casino. She met him on April 13th. Miss Covington went to that meeting with her assistant, and they talked about the casino. They talked about the square footage. They talked about the number of slot machines. They talked about whether or not to include a concert venue. And finally, they talked about whether or not the Parks and Rec Association should receive any money. Mr. Bancroft agreed that out of his generous $1.7 million that Mr. Bancroft was going to give to the charities and people of Midlands, that $250,000 of that could go to the Parks and Rec Department. And the prosecution's right about one thing. Miss Covington got what she wanted. She was able to get that money for the Parks and Rec Department. She was able to do her job, which is, as Miss Covington has told you, all Miss Covington has ever wanted to do. Serve the people of Midlands and serve them better than anybody else ever has. That's what Miss Covington wanted. And that's what she did that day. Now, the prosecution holds a burden of proof in today's case. The highest burden of proof that anybody can hold in a court of law in the United States. They must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Covington committed these crimes. They must prove to you that there is no other reasonable explanation than the explanation that they have provided that Miss Covington committed those crimes. There cannot be any doubt in your mind. Ladies and gentlemen, they have not met that burden today. In fact, we can go through every single witness in today's case. We can find reasonable doubt in every single one of them. The first witness that was called today is Ms. Corey Hyde. Now, the prosecution has told you that Ms. Hyde saw Mr. Bancroft putting money into a briefcase. Now, while that's maybe true, you never heard Ms. Hyde tell you today that that briefcase ever got exchanged with Ms. Covington. In fact, the only connection that they've been able to find between the briefcase that Mr. Bancroft was putting money in and Ms. Covington was the bellhop, Del Sesto. But Del Sesto, if you recall, couldn't be certain that they were the same briefcase. That's reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen. All Mr. Del Sesto had was less than a half an hour night's sleep, walking around like a zombie, and a slight glimpse at that briefcase. That is reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Del Sesto could not tell you today that he was absolutely certain that Miss Covington had the same briefcase. In fact, all he could tell you was that they looked the same. Well, ladies and gentlemen, having similar-looking briefcases is not beyond a reasonable doubt. There is your reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen. Finally, from the prosecution, we heard from Miss Benitez. And Miss Benitez did tell you that she found a briefcase full of cash in Miss Covington's house. She also told you that her first reaction to that was Miss Covington must have won big at the casino that night. A statement that you heard corroborated by Miss Covington and Miss Thomas. That's reasonable doubt. You also heard from the prosecution of this 250,000 reasons why. Now, the prosecution's telling you then that the bribe should be $250,000. The only piece of evidence that you've been handed today is a bank statement by Miss Covington that says she deposited $200,000. Well, where's the other $50,000? That's quite a large sum of money, ladies and gentlemen. That's reasonable doubt. The prosecution has not been able to show you where that other $50,000 gone, where it went, or even who has it. It's It's reasonable doubt. You heard from Miss Covington today, ladies and gentlemen. You heard that she told you that she never received a bribe, that no briefcase was ever exchanged with Mr. Bancroft, that she would never do anything to hurt the people of Midlands. She wouldn't even help her only stepsister when she was in dire financial straits. She refused to use her political power, but she did offer her a place to stay. She did everything that she could within the bounds of the law. Miss Covington is not someone who could be bribed. She's someone that works for the people of Midlands and them alone. You heard from Allie Thomas today, ladies and gentlemen. Allie Thomas was the only person other than Chase Covington who was at the meeting where the briefcase was supposedly exchanged, according to the prosecution. Ms. Covington told you that no exchange took place, so let's look at Ms. Thomas' testimony. And Ms. Thomas told you not that she saw a briefcase exchange, but that simply two people walked in with similar briefcases, and they both left with similar briefcases. She can't tell you whether an exchange took place. She doesn't know whether an exchange took place. In fact, she's almost positive that an exchange did not take place. That's reasonable doubt. And finally, you even heard from Dr. J.D. Lorne, who came in and told you that it's possible that Miss Covington shouldn't even have been here today. Now, if you're looking for reasonable doubt, ladies and gentlemen, it's here. It's here in abundance. You can't miss it. And if you think that any of the situations that I've given you so far could be possible, are reasonable at all, you can't find Miss Covington guilty. If you think that perhaps, where did that $250,000 go? Maybe Miss Covington got $200,000 put into her bank account by winning big, like both she and Miss Thomas said. Perhaps Mr. Bancroft never exchanged that money that he put into his briefcase. Perhaps that $250,000 on the note really went to the Parks and Rec department. And perhaps Mr. Del Sesto was simply confused when he saw them with a similar briefcase. That's 5 instances of reasonable doubt right there, ladies and gentlemen, and that's not even all of them. That's not even all of them. There's an abundance of reasonable doubt in today's case, and the prosecution is just fishing for whatever evidence they can find. They've been out there fishing for a long time today, ladies and gentlemen, but have caught nothing. I ask you, when you go back to deliberate in a few minutes, that you discuss these instances of reasonable doubt. That you look and you analyze this case for the facts of the evidence. If you do so, there's only one conclusion that you can reach. You cannot find Miss Covington guilty of the crimes that the prosecution has charged them with. You must find Miss Covington innocent, not guilty. Thank you.